Volkswagen workers have begun rolling strikes as part of an escalating dispute at one of Germany's largest employers, with discussions between European leaders such as the President of the European Council and the European Commission focusing on strengthening ties and advancing the ratification of the CETA free trade agreement with Japan. However, there is a deeper and more troubling layer to this situation: the escalating trade tensions between Germany and the United States. This has impacted what many considered the most stable and harmonious relationship within the Western world. Adding to the complexity of the situation is Canada's involvement, making this issue even more complicated than anyone could have imagined just a few years ago. A tariff of 25% on steel imports into the United States has caused significant concerns for both Germany and Canada, two economic giants on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Germany, a powerhouse within Europe, and Canada, a key player in North America, are now discussing joint measures in response to the tariffs imposed by the US on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. This situation represents a dramatic shift from a time when the United States and its allies were seen as being in sync. The impact of these tariffs has been particularly significant given the role of steel and aluminum in vital industries like automotive, construction, machinery, and defense. For decades, Canada has been the US's largest supplier of steel and aluminum, and Germany is among Europe's leading steel producers. The imposition of tariffs on these materials has raised alarm, especially considering that these metals are critical in manufacturing, including the automotive industry, which has been vital to both countries. The US's decision to impose tariffs came under the guise of protecting American industries, particularly its steel and aluminum producers. President Donald Trump argued that these measures were necessary to revive U.S. manufacturing, which he claimed was being undermined by trade agreements he saw as detrimental to American interests. This resulted in a swift and vehement response from the United States' closest allies, including Canada and the European Union. Both nations, whose economies are deeply intertwined with the U.S., found themselves unexpectedly targeted by these tariffs, which they argued were unfair. Germany's automotive sector, which includes global brands like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen, was particularly affected by Trump's proposed tariffs on imported cars. These companies export hundreds of thousands of vehicles to the US market every year, and the threat of a 25% tariff on these cars raised alarms. Such a tax would drastically increase vehicle prices, reduce sales, and potentially lead to significant job losses in Germany's vital automotive industry. At that moment, the issue for Berlin became clear: they could not simply sit back and allow their most important sector to be threatened by tariffs without responding. Germany's response to the US tariffs has been to rally the European Union, which traditionally oversees trade policy decisions for its member states. The European Commission had already prepared a list of countermeasures, such as imposing tariffs on US agricultural products and whiskey, to balance the scales. However, Germany was concerned about the slow-moving decision-making processes within the European Union and signaled its intention to take national action if necessary. This included potential retaliatory tariffs and measures aimed directly at US exports, particularly in sectors where Germany's interests were most vulnerable. The German government stressed that its decision to act unilaterally was not an attempt to undermine the European Union but rather to protect its own industries, which it argued were too important to wait for the EU's slow bureaucratic processes. The idea of unilateral action raised eyebrows within the EU, with some members questioning whether Germany was putting its own interests ahead of the collective European position. Germany, however, insisted that it was not looking to go it alone, but instead to act swiftly to protect its economy and workforce, particularly in industries that were at immediate risk. Canada, too, found itself in a difficult position. As a key supplier of steel and aluminum to the US, it was heavily impacted by the tariffs. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau voiced his country's frustration, declaring the US tariffs to be unfair and signaling that Canada would take retaliatory measures. Initially, Canada's approach was to target specific sectors in the US economy with tariffs, aiming to strike at influential domestic lobbies that might pressure Washington to reconsider. However, the situation soon became clear to both Germany and Canada. They were facing the same issue, and it made sense to consider working together to oppose the US tariffs. Germany and Canada recognized that by aligning their efforts, they could create a more formidable force. The idea was that if the US had to deal with simultaneous retaliation from both Germany and Canada, it could potentially force Washington to reconsider its stance. The US might be unwilling to risk a trade war with both Germany and Canada at the same time, especially given the potential repercussions for American exports. The idea of cooperation between Germany and Canada sent a clear message that these two countries were united in opposition to what they perceived as unjust trade practices by the US. Germany's proactive stance in initiating talks with Canada also caused surprise in Brussels. The European Union typically handles trade policy on behalf of its members, and many wondered why Germany felt the need to engage with Canada separately. Germany, however, argued that the European Union's decision-making processes could be too slow to address the immediate threat posed by US tariffs. By pursuing direct negotiations with Canada, Germany hoped to create a unified and rapid response. While some critics within the EU saw this as Germany acting in its own interest, the German government insisted that the goal was not to undermine the EU but to protect the country's core industries. As tensions escalated, the possibility of a broader trade war loomed. The US has long been a dominant player in the global economy, and many countries, including Germany and Canada, rely on access to the American market. The imposition of tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles would significantly raise the cost of exporting these goods to the US, making them less competitive in the American market. The potential for job losses and economic harm in both Germany and Canada was real, and both countries knew that they had to act quickly. The EU, for its part, sought to maintain unity in its approach to trade policy. The European Commission, tasked with managing trade relations on behalf of the EU, emphasized the importance of a coordinated response. However, Germany's desire for a more rapid and focused response raised concerns about the potential for division within the EU. At the same time, Canada, which had long been a loyal ally of the US, found itself at odds with its neighbors' protectionist policies. This shift in dynamics was a clear indication of the changing nature of international trade relations, where long-standing alliances were being tested in ways that had previously seemed unimaginable. Germany and Canada's pursuit of joint action against the US tariffs also highlighted the growing trend of protectionism in global trade. The US under Trump had adopted a more aggressive stance on trade, focusing on bilateral agreements and attempting to separate its allies in order to exploit individual weaknesses. This approach had proven effective in the past, but the coordinated response from Germany and Canada suggested that the US might be facing stronger opposition than it had anticipated. The reality was that a trade war with both Germany and Canada would have significant consequences, not just for these countries but for the US economy as well. The key concern for both Germany and Canada was the potential economic fallout from a prolonged trade conflict. The automotive industry in Germany, which is at the heart of its economy, would be severely impacted by a 25% tariff on cars. Prices would rise, sales would fall, and the entire industry could face significant disruption. Similarly, Canada's integration with the US economy, particularly in the automotive sector, meant that any increase in tariffs would also hurt its economy. Both countries understood that they could not afford to take these issues lightly, and thus, they were exploring every avenue for retaliation. The European Union, meanwhile, had its own concerns. While it wanted to ensure a unified approach to trade, it also understood the urgency of the situation. Germany's actions, though controversial, were seen as a necessary step to protect the country's economy. The potential for retaliation was not something the EU could ignore, especially when the survival of key industries was at stake. At the same time, there were fears that Germany's pursuit of separate negotiations with Canada could create tensions within the EU, as it was seen as undermining the collective position. Ultimately, the path forward is unclear. The possibility of a full-blown trade war remains, but so does the hope for a diplomatic resolution. Economists caution that trade wars rarely have winners, and both sides would suffer. The most likely scenario may be some form of compromise, where the US reduces or delays its tariffs, while Germany and Canada hold off on retaliatory measures. However, much will depend on the outcome of the 2025 US presidential elections, which could alter the course of US trade policy. In conclusion, the transatlantic relationship between Germany, Canada, and the United States is at a critical juncture. The tariff dispute represents a broader shift in global trade dynamics, where protectionist policies are becoming more common, and old alliances are being tested. While the outcome is still uncertain, one thing is clear. The world is watching closely, and the consequences of this trade dispute will be felt for years to come. As the trade dispute between the United States and its closest allies escalates, it's clear that the global trade landscape is shifting in unpredictable ways. The previously unthinkable alliance between Germany and Canada against US tariffs demonstrates how much the nature of international relations has evolved. For years, these nations were seen as stable partners in the Western economic order, but today, they are finding themselves at odds with Washington's protectionist measures. While the US government continues to argue for its tariffs as a way of protecting domestic industries, countries like Germany and Canada see these actions as detrimental not only to their economies but also to global trade stability. The potential consequences of this trade war extend far beyond just steel and aluminum tariffs. If President Trump moves forward with imposing a 25% tax on automobiles, the ripple effects could cause significant disruptions in key sectors like the automotive and manufacturing industries. German brands such as BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz have long enjoyed access to the US market, and the tax increase would severely affect their sales and long-term growth prospects. Similarly, Canada, which has tightly integrated its auto industry with the US market, faces significant risks if trade barriers become more entrenched. These countries, along with the European Union, are now grappling with the question of how to respond in a way that minimizes damage and maintains their economic stability. As they weigh their options, the possibility of a coordinated response that challenges the US on multiple fronts is becoming more likely. This joint stance could force Washington to reconsider its approach, especially if its trade partners band together, making it difficult to isolate each country and negotiate separate deals. Ultimately, the outcome of this trade dispute will depend on political and economic forces that are still unfolding. The global economy is interconnected, and what happens in one country can have ripple effects across the world. As the situation develops, the hope remains that both sides can find a solution that avoids further escalation and leads to more balanced, fair trade practices. The shifting dynamics of global trade are also being shaped by larger geopolitical tensions, such as the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. This complex backdrop makes the trade dispute between the United States, Germany, Canada, and the European Union even more significant. As these countries continue to stand firm in opposition to US tariffs, the stakes are raised not just for their economies but for international stability. The intertwining of trade policies with national security concerns adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. In this context, both Germany and Canada are seeking to assert their economic independence while maintaining their alliances with the US. Germany's decision to prioritize its national interests over the European Union's collective stance is a noteworthy shift, signaling a broader trend of countries re-evaluating their roles in a changing global order. The possibility of a transatlantic trade war looms, but the hope remains that diplomacy will prevail. Trade wars have far-reaching consequences, often leading to higher consumer prices, disruption in supply chains, and a slowdown in economic growth. A prolonged conflict could undermine the trust and cooperation that have defined the Western alliance for decades. In the coming months, the world will watch closely as the US, Germany, Canada, and the EU navigate these choppy waters, hoping for a resolution that ensures long-term stability for all parties involved.